On the evening of the 22nd of May last year, I'm sure most of you will remember where you were. I was lying in bed, and as I'm sure many of you do, I was staring blankly into my smartphone. I was about to go to sleep when I noticed a sort of flurry of messages and tweets start to pop up about an accident of some kind in the city centre, a bang, a collision, something like that. With social media being social media, it was mostly just guesswork and speculation from everybody. No one really knew what was going on. I'd been in the city a few years ago when the riots had happened, and I'd seen the effects of this kind of guesswork and speculation when the facts weren't really known. I voiced my opinion, and I've edited it for swearing, but what I said was, I'd sent a tweet out saying, explosions or bangs of some kind happening at Victoria Station. Idiots were already tweeting misinformation and conjecture. Shut up. I hit send, put my phone on silent, and went to sleep. When I woke up, I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was about 6 in the morning, and it became very obvious straight away that something was quite wrong. I had hundreds and hundreds of messages and tweets, and dozens of missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. And it quickly became apparent that the worst of the rumors from last night had been true. There had been a terrorist attack in Manchester. And the reason that I had been bombarded with so many messages was that my younger brother Martyn had been at the concert and was missing. He'd been at the Ariana Grande concert, and initially I was confused because I will admit fully that I'd never heard of Ariana Grande. I'm sorry. And for a little while, I thought it was one of his friends called Ariana Grande, and it was like, have you tried? He was at Ariana Grande's. Why don't you ring Ariana? Should we knock at her house? That kind of thing. So what had happened was that the explosion had happened at the very end of the concert after it had finished. And the last tweet that he'd sent, we're both prolific Twitter abusers, he wrote a tweet at about 10:30 complaining that he'd snuck to the toilet during a Macy Gray cover, and he was moaning that everybody else had had the same idea. And that was the last we'd heard. That day, for me and so many people in this city, turned into the longest day I will ever endure. My family were rushed with all the other families to the Etihad football stadium where the police had set up an emergency zone. I stayed at home, sat on the floor surrounded by computers, laptops, tablets, scouring news feeds for any trace, any update. I had the TV news on in the background. I was sending out his photograph to everybody. It was just a state of complete panic. At the same time, my life also became a rolling battle with fairly aggressive journalists who swamped me with requests for information and for interviews and that sort of thing. So going from naught to maximum intensity very, very quickly. A couple turned up at my place of work as if I'd be there, and one came to my house and pushed a note under the door asking if he could have an interview. Bear in mind, this doesn't seem very much now, but at the time, any knock could have been the police or worse, you know? By late afternoon, we'd been able to pinpoint his location fairly well through other people's photographs. There were just dozens of photos of him dancing and drinking and partying. We knew kind of where he'd been, but we'd not heard anything official. As evening drew in, my sisters and I were bundled into a police car, and we were rushed to the Etihad Stadium with blue lights on, sirens blaring, the traffic parting in front of us. A few very difficult hours later, and we all left the stadium together as a family, carrying the heartbreaking knowledge that Martyn had been identified as one of the 22 people who'd been killed that day. The next few days were unbelievably difficult for everybody, but the way the city rallied together was completely incredible. I received more messages of support than I could possibly ever respond to. I stood with the rest of you and watched Tony Walsh hold the city at a complete standstill with that electric reading of This Is the Place. I stood on stage a few days later at the Deaf Institute's sold-out benefit concert, trying not to cry in front of the crowd as I sort of thanked the city in some way from the bottom of my heart, really. I really feel that the true character of a place and its people comes out in a crisis, and I can honestly say I've never been more fiercely proud to be from this city. Now, of all of these experiences, there's one particular one I feel it's important for me to tell you about. It was a few weeks after everything happened, and the police reached out to the families to say that it would be possible to visit the arena. It was still closed, so the police had control over it. Many families said no, and many members of my family said no too. It was a very personal decision. Ultimately, I decided that I had to know, I had to see. So a few days later, I found myself with a few members of my family on an average rainy Manchester afternoon, standing in the empty and completely silent lobby of the Manchester Arena. Every surface around me was marked by an uncountable number of shrapnel impacts. Every glass panel was shattered. Every stone wall tile cracked. Every bit of metal in the place was punctured and marked. On the floor around me, in fact, there was one takeaway image that will stay with me. Completely above me, there was a single security camera looking down at the center of the room, and its single glass lens had been shattered by a piece of shrapnel. And the whole experience was images like that will just stay with you. Around me on the floor were 22 red roses spread out around the center of the attacker. I knelt on the floor and put my hand on the polished floor tiles, and underneath my hand, the floor sort of gave way to rough, recessed stone, and I knew this to be the exact spot that the bomb had been detonated. The 22 red roses were spread around this point. Most were in concentric circles around the attacker. One or two were just impossibly far away. One of the candles, about 7 feet away, so perhaps from here to there, had a small candle burning next to it, placed there by the police, and I knew it was the rose that marked where my brother had been found. Now, the reason that I've described this scene to you today in such detail is that it's important for me to get across that I've seen, in a very literal sense, the devastation that happens when an attack of this nature happens. It's impossible to comprehend the scale and ferocity of an attack until you've stood in the center of the aftermath. And I'd not considered what it would look like, but it was completely overwhelming. But despite having been witness to this destruction, what I've learned through my experiences since that day is that the true damage of violent extremism extends far, far beyond what I saw that day. Our responses as individuals and as communities are quite literally what imbues terrorism with its strength and with its power. And this isn't just speculation, and this isn't just an emotional response. The Home Office released statistics last year saying that hate crimes had risen by a third. 87% of those hate crimes had race or religion as a contributing factor. It's an astonishing number. Bear in mind that these are always conservative measures as well, because an enormous number of hate crimes go unreported. Within this data, there are clear spikes in hate crimes that correspond exactly with attacks in London. This is thousands of retaliations perpetrated upon a peaceful Muslim population in direct response to isolated extremist acts. I've learned that those who respond to violence with more violence are in fact doing the least constructive and most damaging thing they could possibly do. When a gang of thugs smash up a mosque, when a Muslim family is attacked in their own home, this is actually just further damage from extremism. The damage is immeasurably wide-ranging and destructive. It's not just about the bomb. The damage carries on far beyond. The person who carried out this attack was the son of Libyan immigrants. He grew up on the same street I did, the same streets my brother did. My brother and I are, in fact, the sons of a Turkish immigrant, my mother, who sat on the front row, and my dad is British. Now, the similarities between us were striking, even at the very, very start. Because although we led very similar lives in the same city, at some point his path diverged into radicalization and extremism. And this similarity showed me one thing very clearly, that if you use the actions of an extremist to demonize Islam or all immigrants, you demonize me and my family too. And worse, you demonize thousands and thousands of innocent people whose only crime is to share a birthplace or a faith or a culture. And this is why I spoke out. Now, let me say it very, very clearly for those at the back, my thoughts on this. If you use the actions of extremists to validate your prejudice against an entire section of our society, that is racism. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. I can't be racist because Islam is not a race. I've heard this a lot. And I think you're splitting hairs at this point, really. The net result of all this is that Islamophobia has become almost completely normalized for so many. Now let's look at the other side of the extremism spectrum. In June 2016, Jo Cox was murdered by a right-wing, far-right neo-Nazi extremist on the streets of the constituency she served. The right-wing newspaper that has used its pages for decades to demonize Islam and immigration didn't report the same in this case, instead choosing to describe the attacker as a loner with a history of mental illness. I'm sure you've read this kind of thing before. A few weeks later, when he was sentenced to life imprisonment, they pushed the story back to page 30 instead of accurately reporting the judge's own verdict that this attack was carried out to further a white supremacist ideology. Now, as a citizen, I don't have the power to stop a terrorist attack, but as citizens, we absolutely hold the power to effect change within ourselves and our communities, and we can fix this. My idea we're spreading is that although how do I say this? My idea we're spreading, I suppose, is that we all have the power to change things, but we're speaking to the wrong people about extremism. Now, let me explain. Since the attack, and particularly since taking such a public stance as I'm doing now, I have spent a long time reading and in moments of weakness responding to some of the most unbelievable abuse and aggressive commentary, let's say, that you can imagine. And I very, very quickly realized that attempting to meaningfully engage with these people is completely impossible. It's time wasted. Trying to offer counterpoint or argument to a viewpoint that's just utterly entrenched in racism and xenophobia is impossible. And this isn't just online. I was there that night when a prominent far-right commentator chose to launch his self-published Islamophobic book on the streets of Manchester. He chose this city, our city, my city, for one reason alone. That was the attacks. I was there at the counter-protest, and I heard the same abuse screamed at my face in real life, and that kind of thing, it really, really stays with you. Now, this hostile defense of Britishness is something that it pervades a lot of the argument put forth by the far right. Taking our country back, that kind of deal. But I question what it is that they're defending, because I don't think it exists. For me, true Britishness is built on a foundation of multiculturalism, from our music to our food to our British eccentricity. We are a multicultural society. And I feel that genuine national pride is actually a fine thing, but this distorted, hostile nationalism is not that. And those who disagree are labelled as traitors, and I've been called this too recently. I would say that surely the real traitors to this country are those that seek to misappropriate, subvert, or weaponize our values against one another. It's worth thinking about. So if this is not where the conversation happens, and it clearly isn't, then where? Well, to fix a problem as big as extremism, I believe that a real deep cultural change is needed, and in order to do that, we need to speak to the next generation of citizens. Recently, I became a founder member of Survivors Against Terror, an anti-extremism working group formed by Brendan Cox and a diverse group of others. We have all been affected by violent extremism, and we aim to use our collective voice and experience to effect proper, tangible change in our communities, our policies, and our support networks. Discussing these issues openly with young people is a really, really fundamental part of our work. And when I go into these places, so schools, colleges, I've spent a long time doing this now, and when I go into these places, I don't have slides and I don't have a script. I converse with students. I don't talk at students. And this is an incredibly important distinction that so many are not making. I've found, without fail, that these students are just surprised to not be spoken down to. Discount young people at your peril. And they're just happy to be engaged in what's quite a frank and honest discussion about these issues, which is something that often they don't get. And I found that they're hungry for information and for context and for balanced insight from other resources, because quite often young people in particular, are receiving their info from singular sources, which is either the press, who have their own agenda, or from those in the argument that shout the loudest, which is not the right balance whatsoever. And when a person receives all their information from single sources, then in the worst cases, that's where extremism comes from. And in their enthusiasm to engage with what is an extremely difficult thing to talk openly about, I see one thing. I see change. There is potential there. Or, put this another way, and if you take anything away today, make it this bit. Imagine a scenario in which the radicalized young man who carried out this attack on this city had been exposed to voices other than those that led him from the path. What happened in this city was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions for so many of us, and we cannot let its legacy be more hatred and division between us. We just can't. It took losing someone for me to realize that we all have a stake in this, and that we all have the ability to change things, really change things. My brother's name was Martyn, and he seized every moment, and my tribute to him will absolutely be to do the same. Thank you, Manchester.